Robert Pэрri, he sent me a very modest bio. He is someone who broke one of the most important stories in this country's history, the Iran-Contra story, broke it for the Associated Press and Newsweek in the 80s. He's a longtime investigative reporter. In 1995, he started the first web-based investigative magazine, consortiumnews.com, which I trust all of you have been to. He writes prolifically and in very important ways. His latest book is America's Stolen Narrative.
Well, thank you, Katrina. I appreciate that introduction. I guess I should start off by just saying that I've been a journalist in this city since 1977. I've worked for the Associated Press and Newsweek and Public Broadcasting's Frontline, as well as starting consortiumnews.com and as an investigative website. And I have to say that in all these years, I can't think of a time when there has been a groupthink as single-minded as the one we've seen over the past year or so regarding the Ukraine crisis. And this is not to say that there weren't some pretty awful and destructive groupthinks that preceded this one. But I've just never seen a moment when so little questioning has occurred about something as important as whether or not there will be a second Cold War, whether there'll be a possible nuclear confrontation between the United States and Russia that might conceivably end all life on the planet. There's been a cavalier attitude, and not just where you might expect it on some of the TV shows, but you've seen it at the very heart of the most prestigious news organizations in the United States. I would say most particularly the New York Times, but certainly the Washington Post and others fall into this. Now, as I said, I came to Washington in 1977, and that was a time when it's hard to say that that was a golden age of American journalism, but it was a time when the American press corps asked tough questions, did not accept easy government answers, when the press broke through on many government lies, whether it be the Pentagon Papers, the publication of the secret history of the Vietnam War, whether it was not accepting Richard Nixon's blasé explanations for the Watergate break-in, whether it was penetrating into the Central Intelligence Agency's secrets, the so-called family jewels. And so we had seen how the American press corps could work and how, I would say, our founding fathers envisioned it. This is not to say things were perfect, they were far from it, but it was a time when the press understood, I think, the basic responsibility they had to the American people, the implicit agreement that was in the First Amendment, that it's our job to ask those kinds of questions. And even if people don't like us for doing it, even if they call us names for doing it, that's still our job. And there's also this idea that I learned when I was at the AP and even before that there are usually two sides to a story. That you shouldn't assume just one side has all the truth, the other side is completely dishonest. I'm not saying that doesn't happen from time to time, but in my experience, there usually, almost always, is a second side to a story, something that journalists should want to know. I used to interview some of the more despicable people on the face of the earth when I was working for AP and Newsweek and PBS. I spent time with Roberto Dobusan, head of some of the death squads in El Salvador. My job wasn't to judge him. My job was to figure out what made him tick. And I think what we've seen lost in this era now, where we've come to the situation in Ukraine, is that from the very beginning, this was presented in a one-sided way. That the anti-Yanukovych forces had all the truth and honor and decency, and the forces on the side of Yanukovych were evil and corrupt and rotten and had to be overthrown. And there was all simple black and white, almost cartoon-like. And that just isn't the way the world is. And when I started seeing this, I was even surprised, even after the periods of the groupthink around the weapons of mass destruction on Iraq, but at least then there were some voices, a few voices, speaking up saying that the intelligence wasn't that good, that we should look more carefully, even though the major news organizations failed the American people terribly, and they particularly failed the American soldiers who were sent over there to fight a war on false pretenses, with 4,500 of them not coming back alive and many coming back severely wounded, and the American people shelling out $1 trillion or so. But okay, so we get to this issue of Ukraine, and I'm seeing basically the same thing, except even more so, more locked in. And what that's led to has been a failure to ask the hard questions and to push the US government for answers. I know I've only a few minutes, but for instance, there's the case of the Malaysian airline Flight 17 that was shot down on July 17th of last year. Obviously, there are many people with very immediate suspicions of who did it, how it happened, but we really didn't know. It was very interesting, even though the immediate conclusion was that the pro-Russian or the ethnic Russian rebels in the east had shot it down using a sophisticated missile provided by the Russian government. I was told pretty quickly from people reaching out from the U.S. intelligence community that there were other aspects to this that weren't being taken seriously. But there was a rush to judgment. John Kerry, within 3 days, went on all the talk shows that Sunday morning and basically said the ethnic Russian rebels did it and that the Russian government was complicit. I was hearing sort of that the U.S. intelligence community was going off in different directions on that. They still hadn't had a chance to evaluate all the evidence. On July 22nd, 5 days after the event, the Director of National Intelligence released a little white paper, very sketchy, based mostly on social media, also pointing the finger generally at the rebels and blaming the Russians, but not very conclusively, with a lot of things left up in the air. And I kept hearing from inside the community, the intelligence community, that they were finding other things, other people, other suspects. And what became really amazing to me was that at that point, when there were 298 people who had been killed, a serious crime being committed, the US government went basically silent. It wasn't pursuing this issue, at least publicly. I'm told privately, but in the classified world, there was a great deal of progress being made. But this was not being shared with the American people. It was not being shared with the world public. It was not being shared with the investigators into this serious crime. When I checked just last week or so, when I was trying to, because the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, gave testimony in Congress in which she suggested again that the Russians were responsible for this. I tried to contact the State Department. They would not respond. I contacted the CIA. They said call the DNI. I called the DNI or emailed the DNI. And the DNI office very politely got back to me and said, well, here's our latest work on this. It was the July 22nd report they'd put out 5 days after the event. It wasn't credible. This is not a credible response. We know that the United States government, with all its intelligence apparatus, knows a great deal more about this crime, but is for some reason holding back that information. And it falls to the American press, or should fall to the American press, to push the US government on these things. Not simply go with it, go with the flow, accept what was sort of believed back in the first few days after this terrible event, but find out what the US government knows. And why isn't it not helping to bring whoever was responsible to justice? So there are any number of these kinds of issues that have involved this issue of Ukraine, and where the American press corps simply has not done its job right. It hasn't asked the questions. It simply has acted pretty much as a propaganda conveyor belt. The State Department or the US Embassy in Kiev puts out material and the American press publishes it. And that's not the way it's supposed to work. And frankly, it was not the way it used to work. As I say, there was no golden age of American press, but there was a time when we actually did our jobs in a more serious way than we're doing them now. And on an issue like this, where the potential of a confrontation, what one of our writers, William Polk, described as a Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse, and Mr. Polk knows what he's talking about since he was one of John Kennedy's diplomats handling the Cuban Missile Crisis back in the 1960s. He now sees this as a potential to have that kind of serious confrontation between two nuclear powers. And if our lives and the lives of our kids and our grandkids are going to be put at risk that way, you would think at least that the New York Times and the Washington Post and the rest of the major U.S. news media would do their jobs and not just accept whatever they're told by the U.S. government, but press for real answers, push the questions, and act the way I think our founding fathers would have liked the American press to act. Thank you.